More than 8 months ago, Obama assembled an international military coalition to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria. No one is able to say how many civilians have died in this war. One airstrike alone may have killed 50 Syrian civilians, according to the news agency McClatchy. But as Nancy Youssef in the Daily Beast points out, the US is conspicuously avoiding civilian body counts. This does not stop US officials bragging about the claimed ISIS body count, and as early as January, CNN reported that the US claimed to have killed some 6,000 ISIS fighters. Given that ISIS was estimated to have a core force of almost 18,000 fighters, this should constitute a major blow against the group. And indeed, The Independent says, the Pentagon claims that the airstrikes are weakening ISIS. Military pundits are bullish. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Williams, writing in The Times, expostulates, ISIS is weakening, unleash the special forces. This macho-sounding exhortation is based on the claim that the coalition scored a famous victory against the Iraqi insurgency after it was launched in 2005, and could reprise the same success against ISIS by deploying special forces equipped with Death Star technology. If you're struggling to remember this triumph, that is because it is a fantasy. The invasion of Iraq produced the cadres of hardened fighters that became ISIS, and this new war is adding to their ranks. But unfortunately, as far as the media is concerned, we are still relating to the grim reality of the so-called Islamic State through fantasy. ISIS proves to be a shape-shifting enemy. For example, the US claims that its military campaign is aimed exclusively against ISIS. Yet its strikes have repeatedly hit other groups, particularly in Syria, where, as the Washington Post reported, fighters from the Islamist opposition groups Ahrar al-Sham and the al-Nusra Front have been killed by the US. Now, this is controversial because, unlike ISIS, the al-Nusra Front is actually a central component of the Syrian opposition. Thus, US strikes are weakening the opposition that they claim to support, while strengthening the regime they claim to oppose. As the lobby group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting points out, the tendency to conflate ISIS with other groups is common in the media, which inflates the threat by regurgitating alleged ISIS plots that didn't even involve ISIS. But like Al-Qaeda before it, ISIS has become a fungible stand-in for all manner of foes and fears. And to this extent, there is synergy between ISIS's own media strategies and the commercial strategies of the media covering them. The morbid fixation on ISIS doings, both gruesome and mundane, fuels the cult as it grows, as much as it drives up media revenues. For example, when Fox News offered visitors to their website full and unedited footage of ISIS fighters burning a hostage to death, this came from an ISIS propaganda video. And when the Daily Mail reports on the group's terrible culinary skills, this too came from ISIS social media outlets. This also feeds into political strategies, as when ISIS is used as a stick to frighten restless populations. During the Scottish referendum campaign, for instance, a story first published in The Scotsman claimed, with zero evidence, that ISIS were threatening to execute a Scottish hostage in order to secure a yes vote in the referendum. There are many similar cases. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting has listed 10 utterly false major news stories about ISIS in the last year, which appeared in major outlets from Reuters to the BBC to CNN to Fox News. The stories included claims on Fox News that ISIS combatants had entered the US through the southern border, the infamous Mexican wing of ISIS. Clearly, this fabrication had nothing to do with Fox News' notorious hatred for Mexican immigrants. Perhaps most ludicrous was the story about the ISIS Ebola terror plot, which appeared in the Daily Mail, among other newspapers. The story was originally sourced to Iraqi media, but in fact the Iraqi health minister debunked it. Yet despite the constant flurry of frenzied media reporting on ISIS threats, we're encouraged to believe that the group is in fact being weakened by American bombs. In fact, however, the Wall Street Journal reports that ISIS are actually expanding in Syria, and even in the front lines of battle in Iraq, ISIS seems, according to the New York Times, to have held on to most of their key territories. This includes, as The Atlantic demonstrates, dozens of population centers, including millions of peoples. What is more, the war seems to have drastically increased the rate of recruitment of fighters to ISIS from all over the world. The US estimates, according to the Washington Post, that ISIS is recruiting 1,000 fighters per month from overseas. In January, the Pentagon estimated that 19,000 fighters had joined ISIS from across the world. The UN's latest report, mentioned in the Associated Press, says that recruitment worldwide from 100 countries has increased 71% since the war began. The total fighting force recruited from outside the existing Islamic State is estimated now at 20,000. The UN report said that Iraq and Syria had become, since the war began, a veritable international finishing school for extremists. The drastic increase in recruitment may partially explain why ISIS can still launch major offensives, such as the one which recently took over parts of the Iraqi city of Ramadi, according to CNN. How to explain this recruitment wave? The Pentagon spokesperson has a simple explanation. Their ideology is overpowering. This has been the argument of a great deal of media punditry, as much in the educated liberal press as in the right-wing press, from The Atlantic to The New Statesman, where it has been argued that ISIS is primarily driven by Islam and that there is something essential to Islam which mandates what ISIS is doing. Brian Whittaker of The Guardian locates the problem in the culture of Arab states and publics, most of whom he says share the basic ideological premises of ISIS when it comes to religious bigotry and the supremacy of Islam. Now, it is true that ISIS takes its religious justifications very seriously. These include not just the overarching discourse of the caliphate, which it claims to be refounding, but also theologically pedantic justifications for slavery and rape. But the explanations being offered for its growth beyond a tiny cluster of the psychotically violent come from the increasingly threadbare conception of radicalization, according to which people of religious faith are radicalized in their religiosity before becoming terrorists. In fact, the evidence of 4 decades of research on who becomes a terrorist is that there is no common pathway rooted in religion or anything else. Many ISIS recruits are neither particularly devout nor have much religious education. As Alessandra Massi reports in the International Business Times, ISIS goes after non-Muslims as much as the devout. Moreover, in their practical activities, ISIS allies include significant secular currents such as the Baathists. The major obsession of the Anglophone media is the flow of recruits from English-speaking countries such as the UK, the US, and Australia. Here the media have echoed national government concerns. So the Times reports UK government claims that 500 Britons have joined ISIS. The Guardian reports that Britain is at the edge of a cliff regarding recruitment and desperately needs a strategy to prevent extremism among British Muslims. CNN reports the FBI's extremely tenuous claims based on no evidence that American teenagers may be disappearing to join ISIS. But in fact, most recruits to ISIS do not come from English-speaking countries, and focusing on them first does not help explain ISIS. To explain how ISIS has grown, it is necessary to acknowledge where they've come from. As Martin Chulov reports in The Guardian, the core of the ISIS group, including the leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, are former prisoners held in the notorious American-run prison Camp Bucca. Most of the emphasis in these reports is on the way in which the prison brought the fighters together in one place so that they could proselytize and develop a group identity. What The Guardian's report does not mention, and what is also omitted by The Independent, The New York Times, Mother Jones, and The Washington Post, is that during the period in which the group was detained there, the camp was notorious for torture, almost as much as Abu Ghraib. During the Abu Ghraib revelations, the Seattle Times reported that at Camp Bucca, US soldiers had beaten prisoners, stripped them naked, and even placed deadly scorpions on their body to torture them. The Washington Post and Red Cross reported prisoners being kicked repeatedly in the groin and burned. In 2006, Alan Keller, a torture expert from Physicians for Human Rights, recorded brutal torture methods deployed at Bucca, including the anal rape of a detainee with a pair of scissors. This omission is telling. The Daily Mail reports that ISIS tortures prisoners using techniques pioneered by the Assad regime. The chief method they describe, however, is known in English as Palestinian hanging. It was regularly used against Iraqi prisoners such as Manadel al-Jamadi, who was tortured to death by CIA agent Mark Swanner using this method. What ISIS justifies with chilling theological rectitude has already been practiced by the US and its allies, who are now waging war against ISIS. Understanding this context, all but forgotten in the media, is important to understanding why ISIS grows, why it holds territory with small forces relative to those it has defeated, and why it recruits secular allies to its cause. As Alireza Dostar writes for Open Democracy, ISIS emerged from the fires of war, occupation, killing, torture, and disenfranchisement. It did not need to sell its doctrine to win recruits. It needed above all to prove itself as effective against its foes. And that is exactly what ISIS has done.